When Clara stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Silver Creek, Montana, her left arm hung limp at her side, and a jagged scar traced from her temple to her jaw. The other mail-order brides whispered behind gloved hands, but rancher Thomas Whitmore saw something different. While the town looked at her damaged face and withered arm with pity or disgust, he saw the fierce determination in her green eyes and the way she held her chin high despite everything. What he didn't know was that Clara's scars told a story of survival that would change both their lives forever. This is the tale of two broken souls who found healing in the most unexpected place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly under an October sky the color of pewter, and Clara Hendricks pressed her good hand against the stagecoach window as Silver Creek came into view. The settlement looked smaller than she'd imagined, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled against the vast prairie like children seeking shelter from the wind. Dust swirled between the structures, and she could see cattle dotting the distant hills like scattered brown stones. Her reflection stared back from the glass, and Clara turned away quickly. The scar would always be there, a reminder of the fire that had taken everything: her family's bakery, her parents, her younger brother Samuel, and nearly her own life. The flames had also stolen the full use of her left arm, leaving it weak and clumsy. Though she'd learned to manage most tasks with stubborn determination, the advertisement in the Hartford Gazette had been simple enough. Rancher seeks wife. Must be hard-working and of good character. Montana Territory. Inquire Thomas Whitmore, Silver Creek. Clara had responded not out of romantic hope, but out of necessity. The charity home in Connecticut had made it clear that a scarred woman with a damaged arm was a burden they couldn't support indefinitely. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Peterson's general store, and Clara's stomach clenched. Through the window, she could see several men gathered on the wooden sidewalk, their faces expectant. One held a small bouquet of prairie flowers. Another had slicked his hair back with what appeared to be bear grease. They were here for the mail-order brides, she realized, and her heart sank. Silver Creek. "You're the driver," called. "End of the line, folks." Clara gathered her worn leather satchel and stepped carefully from the coach, keeping her damaged arm close to her body. The other passengers, two women about her own age, who chatted excitedly about their future husbands during the journey, emerged behind her, their dresses crisp and their faces bright with anticipation. The men on the sidewalk stepped forward eagerly, but their expressions changed as they took in Clara's appearance. The one with the flowers looked from her to the other women, his smile faltering. Another man actually stepped backward, his eyes fixed on the scar that ran down the left side of her face. "Excuse me, miss," said a portly man with a sheriff's badge. "You wouldn't happen to be... that is, are you one of the brides?" Before Clara could answer, a woman emerged from the general store. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back severely and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze swept over the three newcomers and lingered on Clara. "Martha Whitmore," the woman introduced herself. "I'm here to collect my son's bride." Her eyes moved between the three women expectantly. The two other brides stepped forward, introducing themselves as Elizabeth Morrison and Sarah Jane Fuller, bound for ranchers named McKenna and Hayes, respectively. Their intended husbands claimed them quickly, and Clara watched as they were led away with warm words and reassuring smiles. That left Clara standing alone with Martha Whitmore, whose expression had grown increasingly stern. "So you must be Clara Hendricks," Martha said finally, her voice flat. "Yes." Martha walked slowly around Clara, taking in every detail of her appearance. The older woman's lips pressed into a thin line as she noted the withered arm, the scar, the way Clara's dress, her best dress, though it was patched in several places, hung loosely on her thin frame. "My son didn't mention you were damaged goods," Martha said bluntly. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, but she straightened her shoulders. She'd heard worse in the months since the fire. I wrote honestly about my circumstances, ma'am. If Mr. Whitmore finds my condition unacceptable, I understand. I can take the next stage back east. Martha studied her for a long moment. Can you cook? Yes, ma'am. My family owned a bakery. Clean. I manage well enough with one good arm. Bear children? Clara's cheeks burned, but she met Martha's gaze steadily. The doctor in Hartford said there's no reason I couldn't, ma'am. Martha snorted. Doctor in Hartford? What would he know about frontier life? She gestured toward a buckboard wagon waiting in the street. Well, come along then. Thomas is waiting at the ranch, and supper won't cook itself. The ride to the Whitmore ranch took nearly an hour, following a rutted dirt road that wound through rolling hills covered in golden grass. Martha said little during the journey, occasionally pointing out landmarks, the creek where they got their water, the hill where Thomas's father was buried, the line of trees that marked the eastern boundary of their property. Clara tried to take it all in, but her mind kept returning to Martha's words. Damaged goods. She'd known that's how people saw her, but hearing it said so plainly still stung. She found herself wondering what Thomas Whitmore would think when he saw her. Would he be as disappointed as the men at the stage stop? Would he send her away immediately, or would politeness require him to keep her for a day or two before arranging her return east? The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill, a solid log structure with a stone chimney surrounded by various outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed from the windows. It looked like a home, Clara thought, the kind of place where a family might be happy. If the family weren't damaged goods. A man emerged from the barn as they approached, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. Thomas Whitmore was tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and serious brown eyes. He wore work clothes, denim pants and a blue flannel shirt, but he'd made an effort to clean up. His hands, she noticed as he helped her down from the wagon, were calloused from hard work, but gentle in their touch. Miss Hendricks, he said, his voice deep and pleasant. Welcome to Montana. Clara waited for his expression to change as he took in her appearance, but Thomas simply smiled and offered his arm to escort her to the house. His eyes met hers directly, without the flinching or staring she'd grown accustomed to. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult, he continued as they walked. October can be unpredictable out here. We're fortunate the weather held. It was fine, thank you, Clara managed, still waiting for the moment when he would really see her, really understand what he'd gotten himself into. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and the smell of beef stew filled the air. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a heavy wooden table, simple furniture, and shelves lined with books. It was clean and well organized, clearly the home of someone who took pride in his surroundings. I've got stew on, Thomas said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Nothing fancy, but it's filling. You must be hungry after your trip. Martha had followed them inside and now stood with her arms crossed, watching the interaction between her son and his intended bride. Thomas, she said sharply, perhaps you should take a closer look at what you've brought home. Thomas glanced at his mother, then back at Clara. I can see just fine, Ma. Miss Hendricks looks tired from her journey. Why don't you sit down? He asked Clara, pulling out a chair at the table. I'll get you some coffee. As Clara sat, Martha moved closer to her son. Thomas, the girl is damaged. Look at her arm. Look at her face. Do you really think, Ma? Thomas's voice was quiet but firm. That's enough. Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame. She started to stand, ready to excuse herself, to offer to leave immediately. But Thomas gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Please stay, he said softly. Then louder, Ma, why don't you check on the chickens? I think I heard some commotion in the coop earlier. Martha opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. She grabbed her shawl from a hook and stalked out, letting the door slam behind her. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, and Clara stared down at her hands folded in her lap. Mr. Whitmore, she began, I understand if this arrangement isn't what you expected. I tried to be honest in my letters about my situation, but I know seeing it in person is different. "If you'd prefer to send me back, Miss Hendricks," Thomas interrupted gently. He pulled up the chair across from her and sat down, his brown eyes serious. "What happened to you?" The question was asked with such genuine concern that Clara found herself answering before she could think better of it. "Fire," she said simply. 2 years ago. Our bakery burned, and I was trapped inside trying to save my brother. I didn't reach him in time." Her voice broke slightly on the last words. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I'm sorry for your loss." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "The scar," Thomas continued, "and your arm. Does it cause you pain?" "Sometimes," Clara admitted. "The arm is weak, but I can use it for light tasks. The scar. It's just how I look now." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas stood and moved to the stove, ladling stew into 2 bowls. He set one in front of Clara along with a spoon, then sat back down with his own bowl. "You know, my father used to say that a person's real beauty comes from what they've survived. He had a scar too, from a bull that gored him when I was young. He was proud of it because it meant he was tough enough to live through something that should have killed him." Clara looked up at him, surprised. "You don't find it ugly?" Thomas met her gaze steadily. "I find it remarkable. You walked through fire to try to save your brother. That tells me more about who you are than any scar ever could." They ate in companionable silence for a while, and Clara found herself relaxing for the first time in months. The stew was good, hearty and warming, and Thomas seemed content to let her eat without pressing for conversation. When she'd finished, he refilled her coffee cup and settled back in his chair. "I should tell you about the ranch," he said. "We run cattle mostly, about 200 head. It's just me now since Pa died 3 years back. Ma helps some, but she's got her own ideas about how things should be done." He smiled wryly. "You might have noticed," Clara nodded. "She's protective of you." That's one way to put it. Thomas's expression grew more serious. "I want you to know, Miss Hendricks, that if you decide to stay, it would be as my partner. Not just someone to cook and clean, but someone who helps make decisions about our life together. This ranch needs a woman's touch, but more than that, it needs someone who understands what it means to work hard for something you believe in. And if I can't, that is, if my arm makes it difficult for me to do everything a ranch wife should do." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "Then we'll figure out ways around it. I've seen you pour coffee and eat with your right hand just fine. I imagine you can do most anything you set your mind to." The simple confidence in his voice brought tears to Clara's eyes. When was the last time someone had spoken to her that way? When had anyone looked at her and seen capability instead of limitation? "There's something else," Thomas continued. "I want you to know that this doesn't have to be. That is, we don't have to marry right away. You could stay as a housekeeper for now, if that would make you more comfortable. Give us both time to get to know each other properly." Clara stared at him in amazement. In a world where women had so few choices, where a damaged woman like herself had even fewer, Thomas Whitmore was offering her the precious gift of time and respect. "That's very kind of you," she said quietly. "It's not kindness, Miss Hendricks. It's practical. A marriage should be based on more than necessity, don't you think?" Before Clara could answer, the door opened and Martha returned, bringing a gust of cold air with her. She looked from Thomas to Clara, her expression sour. "Well?" she demanded. "Have you made your decision, Thomas? Are you keeping her or sending her back?" Thomas stood slowly, his jaw set in a way that made him look older and more determined. "Ma, Miss Hendricks is staying. She'll be taking over the household duties, and I expect you to treat her with respect." Martha's eyes flashed. "That crippled girl is going to run my kitchen. This is my house now, Ma, and yes, Clara will be managing the household. If you can't accept that, maybe it's time you considered Aunt Helen's offer to come live with her in Denver." The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Clara held her breath. She could see the war being fought in Martha's expression, love for her son battling against her disapproval of his choice. Finally, Martha's shoulders sagged slightly. "Fine," she said stiffly, But don't come crying to me when you realize what a mistake you've made." She stalked toward the back of the house, presumably to her bedroom, leaving Thomas and Clara alone again. "I'm sorry about that," Thomas said quietly. "She'll come around eventually." "Miss Bark is worse than her bite." Clara wasn't so sure about that, but she nodded anyway. "Where would I—" "There's a small room off the kitchen that was meant to be a pantry, but we never used it for that. It's got a window and enough space for a bed. I can set it up for you tonight. That would be fine." "Thank you." Thomas showed her the room. It was indeed small, but clean and private, with a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. As he brought in a simple bed frame and mattress, Clara stood in the doorway, watching him work. His movements were efficient and careful, and she found herself noticing the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt, the concentration on his face as he fitted the bed together. "There," he said when he'd finished. "It's not much, but it's yours. Ma has some extra quilts in the chest in her room. I'll ask her for them in the morning when she's had time to cool down." Clara walked to the window and looked out at the darkening landscape. Stars were beginning to appear in the vast Montana sky, more stars than she'd ever seen back east. The sight took her breath away. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Thomas joined her at the window. "I never get tired of it. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I come outside and just look up. Makes you feel small, but in a good way. Like your problems aren't as big as you thought." They stood there in comfortable silence, and Clara was acutely aware of Thomas's presence beside her. He smelled of leather and wood smoke, and something else she couldn't identify, something essentially masculine and appealing. It had been so long since she'd felt anything like attraction that the sensation caught her off guard. "I should let you get some rest," Thomas said eventually. "Tomorrow, I'll show you around the ranch properly, introduce you to the routine. We get up early here, is that all right? I'm used to early mornings." The bakery opened at dawn. "Good." He hesitated at the doorway. "Clara, thank you for staying. I know it's not easy, coming to a strange place, dealing with Ma's opinions, but I'm glad you're here." After he left, Clara sat on the edge of her narrow bed and tried to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she'd been in Connecticut, convinced that her life was effectively over. Now she was in Montana, in the home of a man who looked at her scars and saw strength instead of damage. It was too much to hope for, she told herself. Thomas was being kind now, but kindness could fade when the reality of daily life set in. When he had to explain to his neighbors why he'd chosen a damaged wife. When he realized how much she couldn't do with her weak arm. When he wanted children and had to be seen in town with a scarred woman at his side. But as she changed into her nightgown and slipped between the rough sheets, Clara allowed herself a small flicker of hope. For the first time in 2 years, someone had looked at her and seen possibility instead of pity. That had to count for something. Outside her window, an owl called across the prairie, and Clara drifted off to sleep to the sound of wind in the grass, and Thomas's gentle words echoing in her mind. I find it remarkable. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of chickens squawking and boots on wooden floors. Through her small window, the sky was the color of charcoal, with just a hint of pale yellow on the horizon. She dressed quickly in her work dress, a brown calico that wouldn't show dirt, and braided her dark hair back severely. The scar always looked worse in the morning light, but there was nothing to be done about that. The main room was empty when she emerged, but she could hear movement in the barn outside. A pot of coffee sat on the stove, still warm, and beside it lay a folded piece of paper with her name written in careful script. Clara, gone to check the north pasture. Back by noon. Help yourself to anything you need. Thomas. She poured herself coffee and surveyed the kitchen. It was functional, but clearly the domain of people who cooked only when necessary. The shelves held basic supplies, flour, salt, beans, dried meat, but little in the way of spices or fresh ingredients. A small root cellar behind the house might hold vegetables, and she'd seen chickens, so there would be eggs. As she explored the pantry, Martha appeared in the doorway wearing a heavy wool coat and carrying a basket. I'm going to gather eggs, Martha announced, her tone suggesting this was a test of some kind. "I'll help," Clara offered, reaching for her shawl. Martha's eyebrows rose. "Can you handle a basket with that arm?" Clara had learned to manage far more difficult things than a basket of eggs, but she simply nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The chicken coop was a well-built structure behind the house, and the hens were fat and healthy. Clara worked methodically, using her good arm to reach under the birds while bracing the basket against her hip. Martha watched critically, clearly expecting fumbling or broken eggs. But Clara had grown up helping her mother with far more delicate tasks. 16 eggs, Clara announced. Setting the full basket carefully on the ground, Martha's expression was unreadable. Can you make biscuits?" "Yes, ma'am," without making a mess of my kitchen. Clara met the older woman's challenging gaze. "I'll clean up after myself." For the next hour, Clara worked in the kitchen while Martha sat at the table drinking coffee and offering pointed commentary. The mixing was awkward with one weak arm, but Clara had developed techniques over the years, bracing bowls against her body, using her hip as a second hand, working in smaller batches when necessary. The biscuits that emerged from the oven were golden and perfectly risen. Martha took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then reached for another. "They'll do," she admitted grudgingly. "Though you use too much salt," Clara bit back her response. She'd used exactly the right amount of salt, but arguing wouldn't improve her situation. Instead, she began cleaning the dishes, managing the hot water and soap with practiced efficiency. Thomas returned as she was setting the biscuits on the table alongside scrambled eggs and bacon. His face was flushed from the cold morning air, and bits of hay clung to his jacket. "Something smells good," he said, hanging his hat on its peg. His eyes found Clara's across the room, and he smiled. "How was your first morning?" "Productive," Clara replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "The chickens are good layers. Best in the territory," Thomas said proudly. "Pa bought the breeding stock from a farm in Kentucky. Cost him a fortune, but it's paid off." He washed his hands at the basin and took his seat at the table. "Ma been showing you around?" Martha snorted. "I've been testing whether she can do the work without burning the house down." "And?" Martha took another biscuit, spreading it thick with butter. "She'll do," she repeated, which Clara was beginning to understand was high praise from Martha Whitmore. After breakfast, Thomas showed Clara around the ranch properly. The barn was large and well organized, with stalls for 12 horses and storage for hay and grain. The corrals held several horses, including a magnificent black stallion that tossed his head when they approached. "That's Thunder," Thomas said. "Pa's prize stud. He's got a temperament to match his looks, but he throws the finest colts in Montana." Clara watched the horse with fascination. She'd never been around animals larger than chickens and the occasional cart horse. "He's beautiful. Can you ride?" "I never learned. In Hartford we walked everywhere." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "We'll fix that. Out here, you need to be able to handle a horse. I've got a gentle mare that would be perfect for learning." They continued the tour, visiting the cattle in the near pasture. The herd was impressive, sleek, well-fed animals that represented years of careful breeding and hard work. Thomas talked about bloodlines and market prices with the enthusiasm of a man who loved his work. "This is our future," he said, leaning against the fence rail. "Beef prices are rising back east, and the railroad's coming closer every year. In 5 years, maybe 10, we could be shipping cattle to Chicago, New York even." Clara could hear the dreams in his voice, the vision of something bigger than what existed now. "You sound like my father when he talked about expanding the bakery," she said softly. "He wanted to open a second location, maybe supply some of the hotels in Hartford." "Did he get the chance?" "No, the fire happened first." Clara was quiet for a moment, then added, "But I think he would have liked this. The planning, the building toward something." Thomas studied her profile. "What about you? What do you like?" The question caught Clara off guard. When had anyone last asked what she liked? "I don't know," she said honestly. "I suppose I haven't thought about it much lately." "Well, you've got time to figure it out now." They walked back toward the house, and Clara found herself noticing things she'd missed the night before. the care with which the buildings had been maintained. The small vegetable garden behind the house, now mostly harvested but showing signs of careful tending. The way the whole ranch felt like a place where people took pride in their work. "Thomas," she said, as they reached the porch, "why did you place that advertisement?" For a mail-order bride, I mean." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "Loneliness, I suppose, and practicality. The ranch needs a woman's touch, and I'm not getting any younger. But mostly," he paused, looking out over the land, "mostly, I wanted someone to share all this with. Someone who could see what it might become, and you weren't worried about what you might get. A woman could be," Clara gestured at herself, "could be what? Scarred, damaged." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "Clara, everyone's damaged in some way. The fire marked you on the outside, but at least your scars are honest. Some people hide their damage so deep you don't see it until it's too late." Before Clara could respond, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching at a gallop. Thomas shaded his eyes against the morning sun. "That's Doc Harrison," he said, concern creeping into his voice. "He only rides that hard when there's trouble." The doctor reined in his lathered horse and dismounted quickly. He was a small, wiry man with greying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Thomas," he said, slightly out of breath. "Thank God you're here. It's the McKenna place. John's been gored by a bull, and his wife's having complications with the baby. I need help, and Martha's the best midwife in the territory." Martha had emerged from the house at the sound of voices, and she was already reaching for her coat. "How bad is John?" "Bad enough. I've got him stabilized, but Elizabeth's in a panic and the baby's breech. I can't handle both situations alone." Martha was moving toward the doctor's horse. "I'll need my bag and some supplies. Thomas, hitch up the wagon." As Thomas jogged toward the barn, Clara found herself stepping forward. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Doc Harrison looked at her appraisingly. "You'd be the new bride Thomas mentioned. You have any experience with birthing?" "No, sir, but I've helped with injuries before." "The fire," she gestured toward her scars. "I learned about burns and wound care." The doctor nodded grimly. "It could be useful. Elizabeth McKenna is the woman you came in with yesterday, isn't she? She might take comfort from a familiar face." Within minutes, they were loaded into the wagon, Martha with her midwifery supplies, Clara with a basket of clean linens and some basic medical supplies the doctor had requested. Thomas drove, while Doc Harrison rode alongside, filling them in on the situation. The McKenna ranch was smaller than the Whitmore place, with a modest cabin and fewer outbuildings. They could hear Elizabeth's screams before they reached the door, and Clara's stomach clenched with sympathy. The woman she'd met so briefly yesterday, bright with hope for her new life, was now facing her worst nightmare. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. John McKenna lay on a makeshift bed in the main room, his face grey with pain and loss of blood. Elizabeth was in the back room, her husband's sister, trying unsuccessfully to calm her. Martha took charge immediately. "Thomas, you help Doc with John. Clara, come with me." The next few hours passed in a blur of urgent activity. Clara found herself thrust into the role of assistant as Martha worked to deliver Elizabeth's baby. The young bride was beyond exhaustion, her face streaked with tears and sweat. "I can't," Elizabeth sobbed. "I can't do this. I want to go home. I want my mother." Clara found herself reaching out with her good hand to smooth Elizabeth's damp hair back from her forehead. "You can do this," she said quietly. "You're stronger than you know." Elizabeth's eyes focused on Clara's scarred face. You understand, don't you? About being afraid?" "Yes," Clara said simply. "But fear doesn't mean you can't do what needs to be done." Martha glanced at Clara with something that might have been approval, then turned back to her patient. "All right, Elizabeth. One more push. I can see the baby's head." Clara held Elizabeth's hand as the young woman gathered her strength for one final effort. When the baby's cry finally filled the cabin, both women were crying, Elizabeth with relief and joy, Clara with a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. "A girl," Martha announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket. "Small but healthy." Elizabeth reached for her daughter with shaking hands. "She's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." "Thank you both." In the main room, Doc Harrison had managed to stitch John's wounds and get him stabilized. The bull's horn had missed vital organs, but he'd lost a lot of blood and would be weak for weeks. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth caught Clara's hand. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Yesterday at the stage stop, when the men were looking at you, I should have said something. I was just so nervous about my own situation." Clara squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need to apologize. You have a beautiful daughter and a husband who loves you. That's what matters." The ride back to the Whitmore ranch was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that took Clara's breath away. "You did well today," Martha said suddenly, her voice gruff but not unkind. Clara looked at her in surprise. "Thank you." Elizabeth was right to be scared. Childbirth out here. It's not like in the cities with proper doctors and hospitals. Women die. Babies die. But you didn't panic, and you helped her stay calm. That matters. Thomas glanced back at them from the driver's seat. "Ma's right. You showed real courage today." Clara didn't feel courageous. She felt exhausted and emotionally wrung out. But as they approached the ranch house with its warm lights glowing in the gathering dusk, she also felt something else. Useful. For the first time since the fire, she'd helped someone in a way that mattered. That night, as she prepared for bed in her small room, Clara reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 24 hours ago she'd been a burden, damaged goods that no one wanted. Today, she'd helped bring a new life into the world. Perhaps Thomas had been right about scars being marks of survival. Perhaps there was more to her future than she'd dared to imagine. 3 weeks into November, the first serious snowstorm hit Silver Creek with a vengeance. Clara woke to find her small window completely covered with white. And when she opened the door to the main room, cold air rushed in despite the fire Thomas had already built in the hearth. "The storm came in faster than expected," he said, pulling on his heaviest coat. "I need to get the cattle moved to the winter pasture and make sure they have access to the shelter." Could be a 3-day blow. Clara had learned to read Montana weather in her short time on the ranch. 3-day blows were serious business, the kind of storm that could kill cattle and trap people in their homes for weeks if they weren't prepared. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, already reaching for her warmest dress. Thomas paused in the act of winding a scarf around his neck. In the weeks since her arrival, Clara had never asked what she could do to help. She'd simply observed what needed doing and done it. But moving cattle in a blizzard was different from household tasks. "You could help me get the horses ready," he said, after a moment's consideration. "I'll need 3 saddled and extra blankets in the barn, in case we have to wait out the worst of it there." Martha emerged from her room, fully dressed despite the early hour. "I'll start cooking. You'll need hot food when you come back, and if we're snowed in, we'll want extra bread and stew prepared." They worked together with the efficiency of people who understood prairie winters. Clara discovered she could saddle a horse one-handed by bracing the saddle against her hip and using her body weight to help lift it onto the animal's back. It wasn't graceful, but it worked. "You're getting good at that," Thomas observed, checking the cinch on his stallion Thunder. "Maybe it's time you learned to ride." "In a blizzard?" Clara asked, securing the last buckle on the pack horse's gear. Thomas grinned, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Not today, but when this clears, I'll teach you about Buttercup. She's gentle enough for a baby to ride." The morning was a battle against the wind and snow. Clara helped Thomas drive the cattle toward the winter shelter, her face stinging from the cold, despite the scarf wrapped around her head. The animals sensed the storm's severity and moved reluctantly, requiring constant urging to keep them together. By the time they got the herd settled and returned to the house, both were exhausted and nearly frozen. Martha had hot coffee waiting, along with thick slices of bread spread with butter and honey. "Weather like this makes you appreciate a warm house," Thomas said, pulling off his wet boots and setting them by the fire to dry. Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, trying to restore feeling to her fingers. Through the kitchen window she could see nothing but white, snow falling so thickly it created a wall around the ranch house. "How long do storms like this usually last?" she asked. "Depends," Martha answered, settling into her chair with her knitting. "Could be 3 days, could be a week. We've got enough supplies for 2 weeks if we're careful." The idea of being trapped in the house with Martha for days filled Clara with unease. Despite the gradual thaw in their relationship since the McKenna emergency, the older woman still watched Clara with critical eyes, looking for evidence that Thomas had made a mistake. As if reading her thoughts, Martha looked up from her knitting. "I suppose you'll be wanting something to keep busy. There's mending in the basket by my chair, if you can manage it with one hand." Clara examined the contents of the mending basket. Most of it was simple work: tears in work shirts, loose buttons, worn seams that needed reinforcing. She could manage most of it, though it would take longer than it would have before the fire. "I can do this," she said, selecting a shirt with a torn elbow. Martha returned to her own work, but Clara caught her watching as she threaded the needle and began the careful work of patching the tear. Thomas settled at the table with a ledger and began working on ranch accounts. The scratching of his pen, the click of Martha's knitting needles, and the howling wind outside created an oddly peaceful atmosphere. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Clara felt like she was part of a family routine rather than an outsider trying to find her place. The storm raged for 4 days. By the second day, they'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Clara cooked meals that could stretch their supplies. Thomas maintained the fires and checked on the animals in the nearby barn. And Martha supervised everything with her usual sharp-eyed attention. It was during the long evenings that Clara began to understand the family dynamics better. Martha would tell stories about Thomas's childhood, about his father's early struggles to establish the ranch, about the harsh winters and difficult years that had shaped them all. "Thomas was 8 when the wolves came," Martha said one evening, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "Pack of 6, hungry and desperate. They got into the sheep pen one night, killed half the flock before we even knew they were there." Clara looked up from the shirt she was mending. "What happened?" "Thomas grabbed his father's rifle and went after them," Martha continued. "Boy could barely lift the gun, but he was determined to protect what was ours. Samuel, that's his father, found him in the morning sitting in the sheep pen with the rifle across his knees, keeping watch." Thomas looked embarrassed by the story. "I fell asleep before dawn. If the wolves had come back, they would have gotten the rest of the sheep. But they didn't come back," Martha said firmly, "because they could smell the gun oil and knew someone was watching. You protected what needed protecting." Clara began to understand that this story, like many of Martha's tales, was as much about the present as the past. The older woman was telling Clara something about her son's character, about his instinct to protect and provide. On the 3rd night of the storm, Clara woke to the sound of Thomas moving around in the main room. Through her door, she could see him pacing by the fire, silhouetted against the orange light. Something was troubling him. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out of her room. "Couldn't sleep?" Thomas turned, startled. "I'm sorry if I woke you. I was trying to be quiet." "You didn't wake me." "The wind did." Clara moved closer to the fire, grateful for its warmth. "What's wrong?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd learned meant he was worried. "I keep thinking about the cattle. The shelter's good, but if this storm keeps up much longer, we could lose some of the herd," Clara understood. The cattle represented not just money, but years of work and planning. Losing them would be devastating. "Is there anything more we can do?" she asked. "Not until the storm breaks. That's what's driving me crazy. Just sitting here waiting while everything I've worked for might be dying out there." Clara studied his profile in the firelight. "Your father built this ranch through storms like this one, didn't he?" "Worse ones. The winter I was 12, we lost half the herd to a blizzard that lasted 2 weeks, but never complained. Just started over the next spring. Then the cattle know how to survive. And so do you." Thomas looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. How did you get so wise? Clara almost laughed. Wise? I spent 2 years feeling sorry for myself after the fire. I only started thinking clearly again when I got your letter. My letter? It was the first time in 2 years someone had offered me a future instead of pity. Even if I wasn't sure you'd want me once you saw me, at least someone was willing to take a chance. Thomas stepped closer, and Clara became acutely aware of the intimacy of the moment, just the two of them in the firelight. The rest of the world shut out by the storm. Clara, he said softly, I need you to understand something. When I placed that advertisement, I was looking for a partner, someone to share the work and the worries. But I never expected... What? I never expected to feel like this. Like I'd been waiting my whole life for you to walk off that stagecoach. Clara's breath caught. The confession was so unexpected, so genuine, that she felt tears spring to her eyes. Even looking like this? She asked, her hand unconsciously rising toward her scarred cheek. Thomas reached out and gently caught her hand, lowering it. Especially looking like this. These scars tell me you're a fighter. That when life knocked you down, you got back up and kept going. That's the kind of woman I want beside me. Before Clara could respond, he leaned down and kissed her forehead, just above the worst of the scarring. The gesture was so tender, so accepting, that Clara felt something inside her chest crack open, not with pain, but with the possibility of healing. The storm will break tomorrow, Thomas said quietly. And when it does, I want to ask you something properly. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the sun reflecting off fresh snow that lay 3 feet deep across the prairie. Thomas was right. The storm had broken, leaving behind a transformed landscape that sparkled like diamonds under the Montana sky. As they dug out from the storm and checked on the animals, Clara found herself seeing everything differently. The ranch wasn't just Thomas's dream anymore. It was becoming hers, too. And the man working beside her wasn't just a kind stranger who'd given her shelter, but someone she was falling in love with. When evening came and they sat around the fire, warm and fed and safe, Thomas cleared his throat and looked directly at Clara. Clara Hendricks, he said formally, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not just in name, but in every way that matters. Clara looked at this man who saw strength in her scars and possibility in her limitations. Yes, Thomas Whitmore, she said. I will. Martha looked up from her knitting, and for the first time since Clara's arrival, she was actually smiling. Well, she said briskly, I suppose we'd better start planning a wedding. Word of the engagement spread through Silver Creek faster than prairie fire. By the time the snow melted enough for travel, neighbors were stopping by with congratulations, advice, and barely concealed curiosity about Thomas's choice of bride. Clara was kneading bread when she heard horses approaching. Through the kitchen window, she saw 3 women disembarking from a wagon, well-dressed town women whose clothing immediately marked them as the wives of Silver Creek's most prosperous citizens. Oh no, Martha muttered from her chair by the fire. It's the church committee. Margaret Prescott, Susan Bailey, and that gossipy Helen Morrison. They're here to inspect you. Clara's hands stilled on the bread dough. Inspect me? To see if you're suitable to marry the most eligible bachelor in the territory, Martha said dryly. Margaret's been trying to match Thomas with her niece for 2 years. Susan thinks no woman is good enough for any man. And Helen, Martha shook her head. Helen just likes to know everyone's business. Clara quickly wiped her hands and smoothed her hair, acutely aware of the flour on her apron and the scar on her face. She'd known this moment would come, the moment when she'd have to face the judgment of the community she hoped to join. The knock came firm and decisive. Martha rose to answer it, her spine straight with defensive pride. Margaret, Susan, Helen, Martha said coolly. How unexpected. Margaret Prescott swept into the room like she owned it. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with graying hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Her gaze found Clara immediately and lingered on her scarred face. Martha, we came as soon as we heard the news, Margaret said. her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "We simply had to meet Thomas's intended bride." Clara stepped forward, keeping her chin up despite the urge to hide. "I'm Clara Hendricks." "It's a pleasure to meet you." The three women exchanged glances that Clara had no trouble interpreting. Susan Bailey, a thin woman with nervous hands, actually took a small step backward when she got a clear view of Clara's scarred face. "My dear," Helen Morrison said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You poor thing. What happened to you?" "A fire," Clara replied simply, refusing to elaborate. Margaret walked slowly around Clara, taking in every detail of her appearance with the thoroughness of a horse trader examining stock. "And your arm? It seems limited in its function." "I manage well enough," Clara said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "I'm sure you try," Susan said, speaking for the first time. "But ranch life is so demanding. Thomas needs a wife who can handle the physical requirements. The cooking, cleaning, helping with the animals." "She made these biscuits this morning," Martha interrupted, gesturing toward the plate on the table. "Help yourselves." Margaret bit into a biscuit, clearly hoping to find fault. Her expression remained neutral, but she took another bite. "They're adequate," she admitted grudgingly. Though a bit heavy, Clara knew the biscuits were perfect, light, flaky, and golden brown. The criticism was simply a way to establish dominance. "Tell us about your family," Helen said, settling uninvited into one of the kitchen chairs. "Your background. We know so little about you." Clara recited the basic facts: her father's bakery, her mother's death when Clara was 16, her brother Samuel, who died in the fire. She kept her voice level and factual, refusing to give them the emotional display they seemed to be fishing for. "A baker's daughter," Margaret mused. "How common. Thomas could have chosen from any number of suitable young ladies. My own niece Rebecca is accomplished in music and speaks French. Does Rebecca know how to birth a breech calf?" Martha asked sweetly. "Because that's more useful out here than French." Susan leaned forward. "We're simply concerned about Thomas's happiness. This is such a sudden decision. Perhaps if he took more time to consider..." "Consider what?" Thomas's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. Clara hadn't heard him come in, but he stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and his expression thunderous. "Ladies," the three women immediately straightened, arranging their faces into welcoming smiles. "Thomas," Margaret exclaimed. "We were just getting acquainted with your charming fiancé." "I heard," Thomas said, moving to stand beside Clara. His hand settled warm and protective on her shoulder. "I hope you were properly welcoming to my future wife." The emphasis on future wife was unmistakable, and Clara felt a rush of gratitude for his support. "Of course," Helen said quickly. "We were just... that is, we wanted to make sure she understood what she was taking on. Ranch life can be so challenging for someone who isn't... well, who hasn't grown up with it." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Clara has adapted beautifully to ranch life. She's proven herself invaluable in the few weeks she's been here." "Oh, I'm sure she tries," Susan said with that same false sympathy. "But Thomas, dear, have you really thought this through? A wife with limitations might not be able to give you the family you deserve." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She felt Thomas's hand tighten on her shoulder, felt the anger radiating from him. "Susan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I think it's time for you ladies to leave." "Thomas, we only meant..." Margaret began. "I know exactly what you meant," Thomas interrupted. "And I'm telling you that Clara is going to be my wife, with your approval or without it. If you can't treat her with respect, then you're not welcome in our home." The three women gathered their things with offended dignity, making their excuses and promising to call again soon. After they left, the kitchen felt larger but somehow emptier. Clara moved back to her bread dough, needing something to do with her hands. "That went well," she said with forced lightness. Thomas caught her hands, stilling them. "Clara, look at me." Reluctantly, she met his eyes. "Don't let them make you doubt yourself," he said firmly. They're small-minded gossips who have nothing better to do than tear down other people's happiness. But they're not wrong, Clara said quietly. I am damaged. I might not be able to. That is, we don't know if I can have children. And even if I can, do you really want them to look like me? Thomas's hands framed her face gently, his thumbs tracing the line of her scar. Any child of ours would be beautiful because they'd be ours. And even if we never have children, Clara, I'd rather have a life with you than a dozen children with someone else. Martha, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. Those three harpies have been running this town for too long. It's time someone showed them they don't speak for everyone. Over the next few days, Clara braced herself for more visits, more judgment. Instead, she was surprised by the stream of neighbors who stopped by with genuine congratulations and offerings of help for the wedding. Doc Harrison brought his wife, a gentlewoman who admired Clara's needlework, and offered to loan her a wedding dress. The blacksmith's wife came with a basket of vegetables from her root cellar and stories about her own courtship. Even John McKenna, still recovering from his bull attack, rode over with Elizabeth and their new baby to thank Clara again for her help during the birth. Don't let those church ladies discourage you, Elizabeth said as she nursed little Mary. They tried to run me out of town when I first arrived because I was too forward in my opinions. Some people just can't stand to see others happy. The wedding was set for the first Sunday in December. Clara spent her evenings altering the borrowed dress, a beautiful blue silk that had been worn by Doc Harrison's daughter 20 years earlier. The work was painstaking with her limited dexterity, but she was determined to do it herself. 3 days before the wedding, disaster struck. Clara was in the barn gathering eggs when she heard thunder screaming. The stallion's shrill whinnies of terror sent ice through her veins, and she dropped the egg basket, running toward the sound. What she found made her blood freeze. The barn was on fire. Smoke poured from the hayloft, and flames were already licking at the wooden support beams. Thunder was trapped in his stall, rearing and striking at the walls in panic. "Thomas!" Clara screamed, but he was in the far pasture and wouldn't hear her. Martha had gone to town for wedding supplies. Clara was alone, with a barn full of terrified animals and flames that were spreading faster than she'd ever imagined possible. The memories crashed over her. The bakery fire, the smoke, the heat, Samuel's voice calling for help. For a moment, Clara stood frozen, paralyzed by the echoes of her worst nightmare. Then thunder screamed again, and Clara's paralysis broke. She ran to the well, filling buckets with her good arm and racing back to throw water on the flames. It was hopeless. The fire was too big, spreading too fast. But she kept trying, her lungs burning with smoke, her dress singeing from the heat. The other horses were in the corral, safe for now, but Thunder was still trapped. Clara could see him through the smoke, his eyes white with terror as he fought against his stall door. Without thinking, Clara plunged into the burning barn. The smoke was choking, the heat overwhelming. Her scarred face felt tight and painful in the superheated air, bringing back every sensation from the bakery fire. But this time she wasn't trying to save her brother. This time she had a chance to save something. Thunder's stall door was secured with a heavy wooden bar that normally took 2 hands to lift. Clara braced herself against the door frame and used her body weight to lever the bar up and out of its brackets. It crashed to the ground, and Thunder bolted past her toward the barn door. Clara turned to follow, but a burning beam crashed down, blocking her path. She was trapped in the back of the barn, just as she'd been trapped in the bakery 2 years ago. But this time, Thomas's voice cut through the roar of flames. "Clara, where are you?" "Here," she screamed. "In the back!" Through the smoke and fire she saw him, Thomas, running toward her through the flames without hesitation, his face set with determination. He reached her just as another beam began to crack overhead. "This way," he shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward a gap in the barn wall where the fire had burned through the boards. They burst through together, rolling in the snow to extinguish the sparks on their clothes. Clara lay on her back, gasping clean air into her smoke-damaged lungs, alive and whole and safe. Thomas leaned over her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wild with fear and relief. "Are you hurt? Clara, are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, pulling her into his arms. "You could have been killed." "Thunder," she managed. "I couldn't let him burn." Thomas held her tighter. "The horse isn't worth your life, but he's your future," Clara said. "Your breeding stock, your dreams. I couldn't watch it all burn again." As Thomas held her in the snow, watching his barn collapse into glowing embers, Clara realized something had changed. She'd walked into fire again, but this time she'd walked out. This time she'd saved something instead of losing it. The bakery fire had taken everything from her old life, but this fire had given her something new, the knowledge that she was no longer the helpless victim she'd believed herself to be. She was Clara Whitmore-to-be, and she was strong enough to face anything. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns on Clara's window. She woke before sunrise, her stomach fluttering with nervous anticipation. In just a few hours, she would become Mrs. Thomas Whitmore, a future she'd never dared imagine during those dark months in the Connecticut charity home. Martha appeared in her doorway carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression that was almost motherly. The barn fire 3 days earlier had changed something fundamental between them. When Martha had returned from town to find the barn in ashes and Clara safe in Thomas's arms, she'd simply nodded and said, "Well, I suppose you really are one of us now." "Drink this," Martha said, setting the coffee on Clara's small table. "Then let's get you ready. Half the territory is coming to see Thomas Whitmore finally get married, and I won't have them saying his bride wasn't properly turned out." Clara had never had anyone fuss over her appearance before. Her mother had died when she was 16, and there'd been no female relatives to help with her hair or teach her the finer points of feminine presentation. But Martha proved surprisingly skillful with pins and ribbons, arranging Clara's dark hair in an elaborate style that partially concealed her scarred temple. The borrowed wedding dress was a masterpiece of 1870s fashion, blue silk with intricate pearl buttons and delicate lace. Trim, Mrs. Harrison had been a similar size to Clara, and the alterations Clara had made were barely noticeable. When she looked at herself in Martha's full-length mirror, she hardly recognized the elegant woman staring back. "You clean up well," Martha said with grudging approval. "Thomas won't know what hit him." Through the window, Clara could see neighbors arriving in wagons and on horseback. The Silver Creek community was small but tight-knit, and a wedding was cause for celebration. She recognized many faces: Doc Harrison and his wife, the blacksmith and his family, John and Elizabeth McKenna with baby Mary, even some of the cattle ranchers from farther out on the prairie. Notably absent were Margaret Prescott, Susan Bailey, and Helen Morrison. Word had spread quickly about their visit and Thomas's response. In a community where mutual support was essential for survival, their rejection of Clara had not been well received. "Are you nervous?" Martha asked, pinning a small bouquet of dried flowers to Clara's dress. "Terrified," Clara admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if the sun doesn't rise tomorrow?" Martha interrupted. "Clara, that boy has been walking around with a smile on his face since you said yes. He's not going to change his mind because you stumble over a word or two." A knock at the door announced Thomas's arrival. He'd spent the night at Doc Harrison's house, following the tradition that the groom shouldn't see his bride on the wedding morning. Martha went to greet him, while Clara took a final look in the mirror. The woman looking back was a stranger, elegant, almost beautiful despite the scar. For the first time since the fire, Clara felt like she might actually deserve the happiness that seemed within her grasp. "Ready?" Martha called. Clara took a deep breath and stepped into her new life. The ceremony was held in the main room of the Whitmore house, with Reverend Phillips officiating. Thomas stood near the fireplace wearing his best suit, a charcoal gray that brought out his brown eyes. When Clara entered the room on Martha's arm, his face lit up with such obvious joy that several of the women in attendance sighed audibly. Clara had expected to feel self-conscious with so many people staring at her, but Thomas's steady gaze anchored her. He looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, and in that moment, she almost believed it herself. Reverend Phillips had a reputation for keeping ceremonies mercifully brief, and he lived up to it. The familiar words washed over Clara, for better or worse in sickness and in health, and she found herself thinking how those promises had special meaning for them. Thomas had already seen her at her worst and chosen to stay. She'd already proven she could handle sickness and crisis. When it came time for the ring, Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a simple gold band that gleamed in the firelight. As he slipped it onto her finger, Clara noticed his hands were shaking slightly. "I, Thomas Whitmore, take you, Clara Hendricks, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice clear and strong, despite his nervousness. "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you for all the days of my life." Clara's own voice was steady as she repeated the words back to him, meaning every syllable. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Phillips announced, and Thomas cupped Clara's face gently in his hands, his thumbs tracing the edges of her scars with tender familiarity before he kissed her softly. The room erupted in cheers and applause. Someone, probably the blacksmith, let out a whoop that rattled the windows. Clara felt herself blushing as Thomas tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and turned to face their neighbors as husband and wife. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. The women had brought enough food to feed an army: roasted chickens, fresh bread, apple pies, preserved peaches, and a wedding cake that Mrs. Harrison had spent 2 days decorating. The men had contributed jugs of apple cider and something stronger that they passed around discreetly. Clara found herself surrounded by well-wishers offering advice, congratulations, and occasionally embarrassing stories about Thomas's childhood. She was particularly charmed by old Pete Carlson, a grizzled prospector who regaled her with tales of Thomas's youthful attempts at gold mining. "Boy was so determined to strike it rich," Pete chuckled. "He spent a whole summer digging holes all over his father's property. Never found more than fool's gold, but he kept at it till his pa threatened to tan his hide if he dug one more hole near the house." Thomas groaned. "I was 12, Pete, and you told me those rocks looked promising." "Did look promising," Pete insisted. "Just weren't gold." As the afternoon wore on, Clara began to relax. These people weren't judging her appearance or her limitations. They were welcoming her into their community. When little Mary McKenna fussed during the celebration, Clara found herself automatically reaching for the baby, and Elizabeth gratefully handed her over. "You're a natural," Elizabeth observed as Clara gently bounced the infant. "I hope you and Thomas have a house full of children." The comment brought a pang of uncertainty. Clara still didn't know if children would be possible for her, but Thomas appeared at her elbow with a warm smile. "One thing at a time," he said diplomatically. "First, we need to rebuild the barn and get through winter." As evening approached and the neighbors began to pack up their wagons, Clara helped clean up with the other women. It felt natural to work alongside them, to be included in their casual conversation about gardens and recipes and the small dramas of frontier life. "You did well today," Mrs. Harrison said as they washed dishes. "I could see you were nervous, but you handled yourself beautifully." "I still can't quite believe it's real," Clara admitted. Mrs. Harrison smiled. "Marriage takes some getting used to, especially out here where you depend on each other so much. But Thomas is a good man, and you're clearly good for him. I haven't seen him this happy since his father died, after the last neighbor had departed and Martha had tactfully retired to her room." Clara and Thomas found themselves alone for the first time as husband and wife. The house felt different somehow, more like a home now that Clara officially belonged there. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Whitmore?" Thomas asked, testing out her new name. "Mrs. Whitmore," Clara repeated, liking the sound of it. "It feels strange. Good, but strange. They sat together on the small sofa near the fireplace, Clara's wedding dress rustling softly as she tucked her feet up beside her. Thomas had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, and he looked more relaxed than she'd seen him all day. "I keep thinking about what Pete said," Clara mused. "About you digging for gold as a boy," Thomas chuckled. "I was convinced we were going to be rich. Pa tried to explain about geological formations and ore deposits, but I was sure all you had to do was dig deep enough." "Maybe you were right," Clara said softly. "Maybe you just had to wait longer to find what you were looking for." Thomas turned to look at her, his expression growing serious. "Clara, I need you to know something. The fire, what you did to save Thunder. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. But I also never want to be that scared again." "You came after me," Clara said. "You ran into a burning building to save me." "Of course I did." "You're my wife?" "Not yet. Not officially, not then." Thomas reached for her hands. "You've been my wife from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach and looked me in the eye instead of looking away. I just didn't realize it until I saw you disappearing into those flames." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I couldn't let it all burn again. I couldn't lose everything twice." "You didn't lose everything the first time," Thomas said gently. "You lost your family, your home, your old life, but you didn't lose yourself. You're here, you're strong, you're mine. That's not losing everything, that's surviving to build something new." As they sat together in the firelight, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. 6 weeks ago, she'd been a charity case with no prospects and no hope. Tonight, she was a married woman with a home, a husband who loved her, and a community that was beginning to accept her. The old Clara, the baker's daughter from Hartford, was gone forever, lost in the flames along with her family and her unmarked skin. But the new Clara, Mrs. Thomas Whitmore of Silver Creek, Montana Territory, was stronger than the old one had ever been. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, noting her contemplative expression. "New beginnings," Clara said, "and how sometimes the best things come from the worst disasters." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed the gold ring that marked her as his. "Here's to new beginnings, then, and to whatever comes next." Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. But inside, by the warm fire, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore began their life together with hope, love, and the hard-won wisdom that sometimes the most damaged things can become the most precious when they're held by the right hands. The harsh Montana winter gradually surrendered to spring's gentle touch, and with it came changes that Clara could never have anticipated. By March, she was no longer the uncertain mail-order bride who had stepped off the stagecoach in October. She was Mrs. Thomas Whitmore, integral to the ranch's operation and respected throughout Silver Creek. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Through the long winter months, Clara had proven herself in ways both small and significant. When the Hendersons' youngest child developed pneumonia during a February blizzard, it was Clara who rode through the storm with Doc Harrison, her one good arm steady on the reins as she helped deliver medicine and comfort to the desperate family. When spring roundup began and they discovered cattle rustlers had made off with a dozen head during the winter, Clara was the one who suggested tracking the thieves through the muddy creek beds where their horses would leave deeper prints. "You've got a good head for strategy," Thomas had told her that evening, studying the rough map she'd sketched of possible escape routes. "Pa always said the best ranchers think like both honest folk and outlaws." Martha, who had begun the winter viewing Clara as a necessary burden, now defended her daughter-in-law fiercely to anyone who would listen. When Margaret Prescott made another attempt to undermine Clara's standing in the community, this time by questioning her ability to manage the church social committee, Martha had risen to her full height and declared that Clara had more sense in her scarred little finger than Margaret had in her entire body. But it was the arrival of an unexpected visitor in late March that truly tested how far Clara had come. She was hanging laundry behind the house when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. Turning toward the sound, Clara felt her heart stop. Standing by the front gate, travel-worn and hesitant, was her cousin Rebecca from Hartford. "Clara?" Rebecca called again, uncertainty evident in her voice. "Is that really you?" Clara dropped the wet sheet she'd been hanging and walked slowly toward the gate, hardly believing her eyes. Rebecca was exactly as Clara remembered, petite and pretty, with glossy brown curls and porcelain skin unmarked by hardship. She wore a traveling dress of deep green wool that probably cost more than most Silver Creek families earned in a month. "Rebecca," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca's eyes took in Clara's appearance, her work dress, her capable hands, the scar that had faded but would never disappear. For a moment, neither woman spoke. "I had to see for myself," Rebecca finally said. "When word reached Hartford that you'd married some frontier rancher, I couldn't believe it. And Margaret wrote that you'd found someone willing to take you despite everything." The words stung, but Clara found herself standing straighter rather than shrinking away. "Thomas didn't take me despite anything. He chose me because of who I am." Rebecca's eyebrows rose at the confidence in Clara's voice. This wasn't the broken, defeated cousin she'd last seen being loaded onto a charity wagon 2 years ago. "May I come in?" Rebecca asked. "I've traveled a very long way." Clara led her cousin into the house, acutely aware of the contrast between Rebecca's polished appearance and her own practical clothing. But when Thomas appeared from the barn and was introduced to their unexpected guest, Clara watched with satisfaction as her husband's manner remained perfectly polite, but notably cool. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Thomas said formally. "Clara's family is always welcome here." That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Rebecca regaled them with news from Hartford. The city was growing rapidly. New factories were opening, and several of Clara's former neighbors had achieved considerable prosperity. She spoke of concerts and theater performances, of fashionable new shops and elegant social gatherings. "You simply must see the new department store that opened on Main Street," Rebecca gushed. 5 floors of the most beautiful merchandise from New York and even Paris, and the restaurant on the top floor serves cuisine that rivals anything in Boston. Martha listened with barely concealed disdain. "Sounds mighty fancy for folks who can't grow their own food or build their own shelter." Rebecca laughed, a tinkling sound that grated on Clara's nerves. "Oh, Mrs. Whitmore, we don't need to do those things ourselves. That's what servants are for." "And what happens when the servants quit or the stores close?" Thomas asked mildly. "What do you do then?" "Why, that simply doesn't happen," Rebecca replied, clearly missing the point entirely. After dinner, Rebecca insisted on helping Clara with the dishes, though her efforts were more hindrance than help. She examined Clara's kitchen with the air of someone touring a museum of primitive artifacts. "Clara, dear," she said as she gingerly dried a coffee cup, "I simply must ask, are you truly happy here? Living so far from civilization, doing manual labor. Surely this isn't the life you dreamed of." Clara considered the question seriously. The life she'd dreamed of as a young woman in Hartford, marriage to a respectable merchant, children, a comfortable house with proper servants, seemed impossibly distant now. "I'm happier than I ever thought possible," Clara said finally. "I'm useful here. I matter, but the work is so hard," Rebecca pressed. "And the isolation. Don't you miss culture, society, proper conversation?" "I have proper conversation every day," Clara replied. "With my husband, with our neighbors, with Doc Harrison and his wife. Just because we don't discuss the latest fashions from Paris doesn't mean our talk lacks substance." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Clara had been dreading. "And Thomas?" "I mean, he seems nice enough, but Clara, he's so rough, so common. Surely you could have found someone more suitable if you'd been patient." Clara set down the plate she'd been washing and turned to face her cousin fully. "Rebecca, Thomas Whitmore is the finest man I've ever known. He's intelligent, hard-working, honorable, and kind. He loves me exactly as I am. What more could I possibly want?" "But your face," Rebecca said softly. I know you think he accepts it, but men can be so unpredictable. What if he grows tired of looking at... That is, what if he decides he wants a wife who's more presentable? The words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because they carried any truth, but because they revealed how little Rebecca understood about real love. For a moment, Clara was transported back to those dark days in the charity home, when she'd believed the same terrible things about herself. Rebecca, Clara said quietly, when our bakery caught fire, I thought my life was over. I thought the scars made me worthless, unlovable. But I was wrong. These scars tell the story of what I survived, what I endured, what I overcame. Thomas doesn't love me despite my scars. He loves me because of the strength they represent. Rebecca stared at her cousin as if seeing her for the first time. You really believe that? I know it, Clara said firmly. Because every day, Thomas shows me it's true. Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas's return from checking on the horses. He took one look at Clara's face and immediately moved to her side. Everything all right? He asked, his hand settling protectively on her shoulder. Fine, Clara said, leaning into his strength. Rebecca was just asking about our life here. Thomas studied Rebecca's expression and seemed to understand exactly what had been discussed. Well, he said easily, I hope you told her about all the advantages of frontier life. Like the view from our back porch at sunset, or the way the whole valley looks after a fresh snowfall, or how neighbors here actually know each other's names and help out when times get tough. Rebecca seemed to realize she'd overstepped. Of course. It sounds very nice. The next morning brought an early spring storm that kept everyone indoors. Clara found herself cooking for 3 instead of 2, and she couldn't help but notice how Rebecca watched her work, managing the wood stove with practiced ease, kneading bread dough with her one good arm, coordinating a complex meal without seeming to think about it. You've become quite accomplished, Rebecca observed, a note of genuine surprise in her voice. I've learned what I needed to learn, Clara replied, checking the roast in the oven. That's what people do out here, whatever needs doing. But didn't you have help? Servants to teach you? Clara almost laughed. Rebecca, there are no servants in Silver Creek. Martha taught me some things, but mostly I figured it out myself. You learn quickly when the alternative is going hungry. That afternoon, while Thomas worked in the barn and Martha napped by the fire, Rebecca made another attempt to understand her cousin's transformation. Clara, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about being useful, about mattering. Did you not feel that way in Hartford? Clara considered the question. In Hartford, I was the baker's daughter. My value came from my father's business, my family's reputation. Here, I'm valued for what I can do, what I contribute. It's completely different, but surely you miss the refinements of civilized life. Like what? Music, art, literature, sophisticated conversation. Clara gestured toward the bookshelf that lined one wall of the main room. Thomas has more books than I ever had access to in Hartford. We discuss everything from Shakespeare to agricultural journals. Doc Harrison's wife and I have started a reading circle with the other women in town. As for music, Clara smiled, you should hear the songs at our church socials or when the men come in from the range. It's not opera, but it comes from the heart. Rebecca fell silent, apparently struggling to reconcile this confident, capable woman with the broken cousin she'd known in Hartford. The storm cleared by the 3rd day, and Rebecca announced her intention to return east. As Thomas hitched up the wagon to take her to town for the eastbound stage, Rebecca made one final attempt to convince Clara to return with her. There's still time, she said urgently. You could come back to Hartford, start over. With my family's connections, we could find you a position somewhere, maybe even arrange a proper marriage. Clara looked at her cousin with genuine pity. Rebecca, I'm properly married to a man who sees me as his equal, who trusts my judgment, who builds his dreams around a future that includes me. Why would I give that up for a life where I'd always be someone's charity case? As the wagon disappeared down the road toward town, Martha joined Clara on the porch. That cousin of yours doesn't understand much about real life, Martha observed. No, Clara agreed. But I think she's beginning to realize there are different ways to measure happiness. Thomas returned that evening with news that would change everything once again. The territorial government was offering land grants to encourage settlement, and the railroad was finally confirmed to reach Silver Creek within 2 years. What does that mean for us? Clara asked as they sat by the fire. It means opportunity, Thomas said, his eyes bright with possibility. We could expand the ranch, maybe start breeding horses seriously. The railroad will make shipping cattle much easier and more profitable, and it means more people, Clara added thoughtfully. Silver Creek won't be a small frontier town much longer. Thomas reached for her hand.
Are you ready for that?
For changes. Clara thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived, frightened, damaged, convinced she had nothing to offer. Now she was a rancher's wife, a valued member of the community, a woman who rode through blizzards to help sick children and tracked cattle thieves through muddy creek beds. I'm ready for whatever comes, she said, as long as we face it together. Outside, spring wind rustled through the new grass, carrying the promise of growth and change. Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore planned their expanding future, secure in the knowledge that love, real love, could weather any storm and bloom in the most unlikely places. 2 years after Rebecca's visit, Silver Creek had transformed from a frontier settlement into a bustling railroad town. The sound of train whistles now punctuated the morning air, bringing prosperity, progress, and challenges that Clara could never have imagined when she first stepped off that dusty stagecoach. The Whitmore Ranch had grown too. What had once been Thomas's modest cattle operation now sprawled across 3,000 acres, with prize-winning horses grazing in fenced pastures and a herd of cattle that numbered in the hundreds. The new barn, built to replace the one destroyed in the fire, stood twice as large as its predecessor, its red paint gleaming in the Montana sunshine. But it wasn't the material prosperity that filled Clara with quiet satisfaction as she stood on the wraparound porch of their expanded house. It was the letter in her hands, the third one this month from young women back east who had heard about her story and sought her. Advice about answering mail-order bride. Advertisements. Mrs. Whitmore, the latest letter began. I am a 22-year-old seamstress from Boston. My family died in a factory fire last year, and I have been left with terrible burns on my hands and arms. No man in Boston will consider me for marriage, but I have seen an advertisement from a rancher in Colorado Territory. I'm afraid he will reject me when he sees my scars, but I'm also afraid that if I don't take this chance, I will spend my life alone. How did you find the courage to begin again? Clara folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. She would answer it tonight, as she had answered all the others, with honesty about both the challenges and the possibilities that awaited those brave enough to rebuild their lives in new places. Another letter from your admirers? Thomas asked, emerging from the house with their 18-month-old daughter, Grace, balanced on his hip. Clara's heart swelled as she watched her husband with their child. Grace had been born perfect and healthy, with Thomas's dark hair and Clara's green eyes. She was a constant reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Word is spreading, Clara said, taking Grace from Thomas and settling into the rocking chair he'd built for her during her pregnancy. Doc Harrison says 3 more mail-order brides arrived on yesterday's train, all asking specifically to settle in Silver Creek because they'd heard about our community. Thomas leaned against the porch railing, his expression thoughtful. And they're all carrying some burden that makes them believe they're unmarriageable, Clara confirmed. Burns, scars, disabilities, poverty, difficult family situations. They're coming here because they've heard that Silver Creek judges people by their character rather than their circumstances. It was true. Over the past 2 years, Silver Creek had gained a reputation throughout the territory as a place where people could start fresh, where a woman's worth wasn't measured by her appearance or her past. Much of that reputation was due to Clara herself, though she would have been embarrassed to hear it said aloud. The transformation had begun during the harsh winter after Rebecca's visit, when a blizzard stranded the eastbound train just outside Silver Creek for 3 days. Clara had organized the women of the town to provide food and shelter for the passengers. Among them was a young woman named Sarah, traveling alone to San Francisco after being disfigured in a carriage accident. The men of San Francisco, she'd been told, would be less particular about a woman's appearance. Clara had taken one look at Sarah's haunted expression and seen her own former self. Instead of allowing the girl to continue her desperate journey, Clara had introduced her to James Morrison, a widowed blacksmith with 2 young children who needed a mother more than he needed a beautiful wife. The marriage had been a success and word had spread. "Mama, horsey." Grace squealed, pointing toward the pasture where Thunder's latest colt was frolicking with its mother. "Yes, sweetheart, horsey," Clara agreed, adjusting her daughter's sunbonnet. Grace loved the horses almost as much as her father did, and Thomas was already making plans to teach her to ride as soon as she was big enough. "Speaking of horses," Thomas said, "I got a telegram from that breeder in Kentucky. He wants to buy 3 of our mares and is offering double what we paid for the original stock." Clara smiled. Thomas's horse breeding operation had become the most profitable part of their ranch, built on the foundation of Thunder's excellent bloodlines and Thomas's keen eye for quality. They now supplied horses to ranchers across 3 territories, and the Kentucky offer represented a significant step toward national recognition. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd discuss it with my business partner and get back to him," Clara laughed. Thomas had been calling her his business partner since their first year of marriage, and while some people in town had initially found it scandalous, the results spoke for themselves. Clara's head for numbers and strategy had proven invaluable in expanding their operation. "I think we should sell him 2 mares and keep the best one for our own breeding program," Clara said. "And I think we should use the profit to build proper housing for the women who keep arriving here, looking for new starts." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "A boarding house?" "More than that. A place where women can stay while they get established, learn skills they need for frontier life, maybe meet suitable husbands if that's what they want. With the railroad bringing more men to town, loggers, miners, railroad workers, there are plenty of good men looking for wives." "You want to become a professional matchmaker?" Clara considered this. "I want to give other women what Silver Creek gave me, a chance to discover who they really are when they're not being judged by their worst moments." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. A group of riders was coming up the main road, and Clara recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Williams, his badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind him rode several men Clara didn't recognize, their clothing and bearing marking them as city men rather than locals. "Thomas," Sheriff Williams called as they reached the house. "We need to talk." Thomas handed Grace back to Clara and stepped off the porch to meet the riders. "What's this about, Sheriff?" "These gentlemen are from the railroad company," Williams explained. "They've got a proposition for you." The lead stranger, a thin man in an expensive suit, dismounted and approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm Harrison Blake from the Montana Central Railroad. We understand you own some of the finest grazing land in the territory." Thomas's expression grew wary. "I own land, yes. What business is that of yours?" Blake gestured toward the rolling hills that surrounded the ranch house. "The railroad is planning a new line through this valley. Your land sits directly in the path of our proposed route. We're prepared to offer you a very generous sum for the entire property." Clara felt her heart skip a beat. She could see from Thomas's posture that he was already preparing to refuse, but the implications of the offer hung in the air like storm clouds. "How generous?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Blake named a figure that made Clara gasp. It was enough money to buy a mansion in any city back east, enough to live comfortably for the rest of their lives without ever working again. "That's a substantial offer," Thomas acknowledged. "But this land isn't for sale. Mr. Whitmore," Blake said, his tone growing harder. "Perhaps you don't understand. The railroad is coming through this valley whether you sell it or not. We have government backing, eminent domain powers. We're offering to buy your land as a courtesy, but if you refuse, we can simply take it and pay you what we consider fair compensation." Clara rose from her chair, Grace still in her arms, and moved to stand beside her husband. She could feel the tension radiating from Thomas, could see the anger building in his eyes. "Gentlemen," Clara said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned in 2.5 years of managing ranch business. "I think you may have misunderstood something about our situation here." Blake turned to her with barely concealed condescension. "Mom, I'm sure your husband appreciates your concern, but this is a business matter between men." Thomas's jaw tightened dangerously, but Clara placed a gentle hand on his arm. She dealt with men like Blake before, men who saw women as decorative afterthoughts, men who believed that money and power entitled them to take whatever they wanted. "Mr. Blake," Clara continued, "this ranch isn't just our home. It's the heart of a community that depends on us for employment, for leadership, for stability. The horses we breed are sold across 3 territories. The cattle we raise feed families from here to Chicago. The land you want to destroy has been carefully cultivated for generations." "Ma'am, progress requires sacrifice," Blake replied dismissively. "A few ranchers can't be allowed to stop the march of civilization. And what about the dozen families who work for us?" Clara asked. "What about the businesses in town that depend on our trade? What about the women who come here seeking new starts in life? Are they acceptable sacrifices for your progress?" Blake's expression grew irritated. "Ma'am, I'm sure you mean well, but you're being emotional about a simple business transaction." That was his mistake. Clara had learned many things in her years as a rancher's wife, but perhaps the most important was how to channel anger into effective action. "Sheriff Williams," Clara said, turning to the lawman, "am I correct that the territorial legislature recently passed laws regarding railroad land acquisition?" Williams nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am, they did. And those laws require extensive environmental studies and community impact assessments before eminent domain can be exercised?" "That's right." Clara turned back to Blake with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Blake, it sounds like you have a great deal of paperwork to complete before you can even consider taking our land. In the meantime, I suggest you ride back to town and explain to your superiors that the people of Silver Creek aren't quite as simple as you assumed." Blake's face reddened. "Mrs. Whitmore, you're making a serious mistake. The railroad has resources you can't imagine. We will build our line through this valley." "Perhaps," Clara agreed, "but not today, and not without following proper legal procedures." "Good afternoon, gentlemen." After the riders departed, Thomas turned to Clara with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You know they'll be back." "Of course they will," Clara agreed. "But now we know what we're facing, and we have time to prepare. And how exactly do we fight the railroad?" Clara smiled, the same determined expression Thomas had fallen in love with. "The same way I fought everyone who told me I was too damaged to deserve happiness." We proved them wrong. Over the following months, Clara threw herself into the battle for their land with the same determination she'd once applied to learning ranch life. She traveled to the territorial capital to research railroad laws, organized the other ranchers in the valley to present a united front, and wrote letters to newspapers across the territory explaining how the railroad's route would destroy a thriving agricultural community. The fight wasn't easy. The railroad had money, political connections, and teams of lawyers. But Clara had something they didn't expect, a network of women across the territory who had found new lives in Silver Creek and were willing to fight to protect it. Letters poured in from former mail order brides who had met their husbands through connections made in Silver Creek, businessmen whose wives had been unsuitable for Eastern society but had thrived in Montana, wrote checks to fund the legal battle. Even Rebecca, Clara's cousin from Hartford, sent a substantial donation along with a note that read, "I finally understand what you meant about being useful." The legal battle stretched through the winter and into the following spring. During the long court sessions in the territorial capital, Clara often found herself thinking about the woman she'd been when she first arrived in Montana. Frightened, scarred, convinced she had nothing to offer the world. That woman would never have stood up to railroad lawyers or organized a territorial resistance movement. That woman would have taken the money and fled, grateful for any escape from conflict. But Clara Whitmore was not that woman anymore. The victory, when it came, was decisive. The Territorial Supreme Court ruled that the railroad's environmental studies were inadequate and that their route would cause irreparable damage to an established agricultural community. The company was forced to choose an alternate route that bypassed Silver Creek entirely. The celebration that night filled the Whitmore house with neighbors, friends, and the many women who had found new lives in their community. As Clara moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and thanks, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. She had come to Montana as damaged goods, a scarred woman with a withered arm seeking anyone willing to take her. She was ending the evening as a territorial hero, a woman who had stood up to corporate power and won. Quite a transformation, Thomas murmured in her ear as they stood on the porch watching their guests enjoy Martha's famous apple pie. For all of us, Clara agreed, gesturing toward the crowd. Look around, Thomas. Half these women came here thinking they were worthless. Now they're teachers, business owners, mothers, leaders. That's the real victory, not just saving our land, but proving that broken things can become beautiful when they're given the chance. Thomas pulled her close, careful not to wake 2-year-old Grace, who had fallen asleep in Clara's arms during the excitement. I love you, Clara Whitmore, not despite your scars, not because I'm good enough to overlook them, but because of the strength they represent. I know, Clara said softly, and that's the greatest miracle of all. As the celebration wound down and their guests departed into the Montana night, Clara stood in her kitchen washing dishes and thinking about the letter she would write tomorrow to the young seamstress in Boston. Dear friend, she would write, you ask how I found the courage to begin again. The truth is, I didn't find courage. I discovered that I had never lost it. It was buried under grief and fear and the lies I told myself about what my scars meant, but it was always there. The man who answered my letter didn't see damaged goods when he looked at me. He saw someone who had survived fire and was strong enough to survive whatever came next. The community that welcomed me didn't see my limitations. They saw my potential. Most importantly, I learned to see myself through their eyes instead of through the eyes of those who had written me off. Your scars tell the story of what you survived. They are not marks of shame. They are proof of your strength. Come west, dear friend. Come to where people are measured by what they build rather than what has been broken. Come to where your scars will be seen as evidence of your courage rather than reasons for pity. Come to where you can discover who you really are when you're not being judged by your worst day. With love and hope. Clara Whitmore, Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Outside her kitchen window, the lights of Silver Creek twinkled in the valley below. The town was larger now, more prosperous, filled with people who had come seeking second chances and found them. The railroad that had threatened to destroy their community would now serve it, bringing supplies and taking their products to markets across the nation. But the real triumph wasn't economic. It was human. In a world that often discarded people the moment they were damaged, Silver Creek had become a place where broken things were carefully mended and made stronger than before. Clara hung up her dish towel and checked on Grace one final time before joining Thomas in their bedroom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new women seeking fresh starts. The mail-order bride who had arrived damaged had become the foundation upon which dozens of other women had built new lives. As she settled into bed beside her husband, Clara smiled at the irony. She had come to Montana believing she was worthless, and in trying to prove her wrong, An entire community had discovered the value of giving second chances. Sometimes the most damaged things really did become the most precious when they were held by the right hands. And sometimes the greatest love stories began not with perfection, but with the courage to see beauty in broken places. In the morning, there would be horses to train, cattle to tend, letters to answer, and dreams to build. But tonight, Clara Whitmore, former baker's daughter, former charity case, former damaged goods, fell asleep in the arms of a man who loved her exactly as she was. In a home they had built together, in a community that had taught her the most important lesson of all: everyone deserves a second chance at happiness. Everyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.